mode.
Hi, everybody. This is Pete Swisher at Pentegra Retirement Services. Thank you for joining us. We have quite a few people on the line, so everybody's on mute. Many of you are probably aware that the press conference with the president started more than an hour late and is still going on, but we have releases from the White House. We know what's been said, and they've already wound their way through the public announcement phase, and they're now just sort of interviewing other members of the audience. So they're be sure to check out the recording if you're interested in what they had to say, but we're going to give you a summary and try to put this stuff in context. So my guests today are Randy Long, who's the founder and managing principal of SageView, investment advisory firm, one of the largest RIAs in the country, and somebody who's been active in government affairs with me for many years and very well known in the industry. Thank you, Randy, for joining us.
Glad to be here.
And also, we have Tom Clark of the Wagner Law Group. Tom is one of the best-known ERISA attorneys in the country and has been part of this conversation about multiple employer plans, including in some interesting conversations with obscure types of plans with me. And we've had fun with that. So, Tom, thank you for joining us as well.
Thanks, Pete. Happy to be here.
All right. So here's what's going on. We just had an executive order signing ceremony that is, as I said, still going on. They're just now getting to the signing. And so this is the up-to-the-minute news, if you will. This is the news broadcast of what's going on. This is a big deal. So why are we doing this at 3:30 in the afternoon on a Friday before Labor Day weekend? This is fairly big news. We've had a handful of big news events in our industry in the last few years. And 2012-04A, which I'll talk about in a minute, is one of them. But the whole open MEP conversation has been a big conversation. And it certainly looks as though that the Trump administration is intending to roll back restrictions, or so it's perceived, and make it easier to do an open multiple employer plan. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on, but fundamentally what's happening is the president is signing an executive order today. We have a release from the White House of the details of this, and the nature of it is to strengthen retirement security for Americans. And you can see the backdrop here. This is an actual screenshot from the live broadcast. So the logo, if you will, is Securing Americans' Retirement. So let me just talk for a second about what this means. An executive order is just an order from the executive. It's an order from the executive branch. The president saying, hey, you folks who work for me, the agencies, I'm directing you to do something, whatever that something is. It does have the force of law. And force of law is a relative thing, but an executive order does direct the executive branch. In other words, could the executive branch not do what the president says? No, they can't. And the direction in this case, we'll talk about what it actually says. It doesn't say anything other than I'm directing Treasury and Department of Labor to consider guidance making it easier to offer open MEPs. And it uses the term association retirement plans. And at this live signing, you have somebody from the Chamber of Commerce in Charlotte. You have CEO of the National Association of Home Builders and National Association or International Association of Franchisees or something, or that was a franchise association CEO. So there's a focus on the association side of this. But the idea being that presumably the nexus requirement of open MEPs is about to be rolled back is certainly the implication of this conversation. There are also a couple of other things being considered in the presidential order: a review of the required minimum distribution rules, or RMD rules, to allow people to keep money in plans longer instead of being forced to distribute under the current schedule. So a relatively minor change, but something that was included to be considered. And also a review and notice requirement. So in other words, a direction to Treasury and DOL to make it easier to use electronic delivery as a default delivery vehicle. So, and on that note, on the particular note of electronic delivery, this is a big expense. So if you're a fiduciary and you're supposed to deliver stuff to people, you're probably not doing it right. And people who are getting notices by just say posting on a website, well, that's actually not allowed under the DOL rules. So it's actually pretty difficult to use an electronic delivery default. And the Department of Labor has a long-standing resistance to changing that approach, with the belief that the AARP and other folks would be disadvantaged by that. So these last two provisions are relatively minor, although the electronic delivery would certainly be nice. We're here to focus on what's the impact on multiple employer plans. So what does this actually mean? And as a little bit of context, back in 2012, I started with Pentegra in late April of 2012. Well, a month later, literally, on the Friday before Memorial Day, the Department of Labor published this advisory opinion that basically said open MEPs are not single plans as far as we're concerned. And the response to this was kind of get on the MEP party, if you will. There was a widespread movement toward embracing multiple employer plans, and pretty much everybody and their brother was going to start a MEP, and there were some goofy structures being contemplated. So there were things like, service providers or individuals saying, I'm going to start a MEP and I'm going to be the fiduciary and I'm going to get paid and I'm going to be a service provider. And, when you say it like that, it's clear that that's probably not an okay structure, but truly there were lots of folks interested in starting multiple employer plans, and that really stopped with the publication of this letter because nobody knew what it meant. At the end of the day, what it meant was if you're running a bunch of individual adopting employers under a single plan document, you have to file a separate Form 5500 with a separate audit and a separate bond for each adopting employer. So that's actually not that big of an impact as people thought it was. That was the effective legal impact. But the industry didn't have experience with multiple employer plans, didn't know what this meant, how to create structures going forward. So many of you have seen since then that there have been things like MEPs, multiple employer aggregation plan, or other types of program, you hear the word exchange. These are single employer structures that try to mimic the MEP, but they don't have the benefit of the MEP. And there's a lot of interest in Congress in this. So here we fast forward. The essence of the White House announcement today, the executive order, is to reconsider guidance that makes it easier to do open MEPs. It would seem logical, therefore, that this is going to be a focus. But let me pause here for 1 second, though. Randy, if you don't mind, you've been part of this conversation for a long time, and I know that you've been looking at these sorts of structures for a long time. What's your sense for both how you look at the history here? Like, where was SageView back in 2011, 2012? Where are you today, and where do you see other advisors?
I think there's a tremendous, opportunity to really, for us as advisors, to help employers, save for retirement, and it's really, evolved. Obviously, the 2012 was a kind of a wet blanket, if you will, on the MEP that everyone was looking to. We thought we were going to, have the open MEP, but looks like we might have that opportunity now. But only 53% of employers that have less than 100 employees have plans. So it's really a tremendous opportunity to gain coverage for those smaller employers and being able to band together. So in the last year, we felt that with some of the bills that have been proposed, before Congress, that MEPs had their day. They will have their day, and so we've created the USA Retirement Savings Plan with Pentegra, and have banded together with a large record keeper, and have been able to take our asset base and negotiate favorable asset management pricing for a program that will keep simplified for the employers to be able to band together and get some favorable pricing. Our role is as a 338. Pentegra is acting as a 316, and then we have a record keeper. So tremendous opportunity, we feel, to help serve clients down market, and think with this new executive order here that it's going to gain some additional traction. So I think it's a great opportunity for advisors to get involved, to either create a MEP like we have, or certainly join forces with someone like ourselves. Our role is as a 338. So we look forward to helping Americans save for retirement and getting more people involved in these plans. And I think that's really what's driving the president's decision. Because if we don't, as advisors, get better coverage, I'm afraid that we're all going to end up in the federal thrift plan?
Well, we have, and this is, if you think of, if we put in context what this announcement was today, this isn't new rules. This isn't new guidance. It's not new legislation or regulation. This is just the president saying, I want you to figure this out. But what's significant about that to me is that it is a direct movement from the executive side, not from the legislature, but from the executive side to ease a direction. So whether or not 2012-04A actually prevented us from doing something meaningful, and it didn't prevent us from using programs that are beneficial. It did prevent widespread adoption of a true open MEP with a single 5,500 in audit, though there are pros and cons to that. But it did stop widespread adoption. So there is an interest in Washington, clearly, in widespread adoption. So the reason we thought this was timely today is that it's actually not difficult for the Department of Labor to change the rules. So the reason this is timely is that this actually is not that hard to change. Now, again, I'm sort of painting the picture here. Whether or not they allow us to do a separate 5,500 audit in bond is actually not that big of a deal. But this public announcement, this major movement, all the interest in Congress, there's clearly a growing wave here. So what we're going to do is I want to give a little bit more context and background, take a few more minutes for that, and then we're just going to start going through some questions, gather thoughts from Tom and Randy, and then maybe have time for a few questions from the audience. So first of all, the players today, the public announcement involved the Secretary of Labor, the Assistant Secretary of Labor for EBSA, Employee Benefit Security Administration, and that's an especially important person for this conversation. Preston Rutledge is the former tax counsel to the U.S. Senate Finance Committee, and as such, he was one of the principal authors of RISA. And we'll talk in a second. We'll talk about RISA and what that means, because RISA still has legs in Congress, and RISA is a bill that would have established provisions for open MEPs. So to a degree, what's going on here is Preston Rutledge knows exactly where the buttons are to push, and there is a regulatory path to quickly allowing open MEPs to be more easily done in the eyes of the industry, and thereby promoting them more rapidly. There is also a direction. So the president has also directed Treasury. He didn't say anything about Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, but did talk about Treasury. So in other words, if there are Treasury regs that would need to be adopted to make things easier, such as the so-called bad apple rule that I'll talk about a little bit more here in a second. And of course, Congress is still a player because they might take action. So if Congress were to pass RISA, if Congress were to pass one of the other bills, and there are about 20 bills that have been proposed since 2010, favorable to MEPs and especially open MEPs. So Congress has a love affair with these things, but Congress isn't the one who stepped up with the first action, because we have not gotten a bill, but it could absolutely still happen. There is bipartisan support. So the question would be, how might executive action interact with that? So a little bit of summary of RISA is in order. I won't go through all of this, but if you want to read what RISA is about, the most recent version of it, sponsored by Orrin Hatch and a couple others, is summarized in an article that you see quoted here. We will post these slides to the website so you can check it out. But in 401k Specialist magazine, if you search for what 401k RISA legislation means for MEPs and PEPs, you see a summary that I did for them a couple months ago. So the idea here is this is a different type of plan. So what's different about these two approaches is one way to make open MEPs easier to do would be to create a whole separate type of plan. So there was, for example, years ago, the USA retirement accounts approach, which was more of an IRA type individual account that was essentially an open MEP. A whole new type of retirement plan. A PEP would be essentially a MEP, but it would be a whole new type of MEP with a couple specific rules, but it would in fact be a multiple employer plan. But there'd be relief from the bad apple rule. There'd be, in this particular version, there's relief for audits. That's significant, but no mention of 403B plans. That doesn't necessarily mean anything, but this just gives you a flavor. This is the legislation that's out there. Well, this could still pass. But one of the things that can happen is this provision, the PEP provision, might not be necessary. So the author of this provision, or at least one of the principal authors, was Preston Rutledge, who is now the Assistant Secretary of Labor for the EBSA, for Employee Benefit Securities Administration. So the guy who knows all about it is in charge of actually changing the rules. So let's shift to some talking points and some questions here. So let me just gather first impressions from you guys. So Tom, let me start with you. What's your first impression of this executive order?
Well, other than the fact that we haven't seen it yet, my first impression of what he's trying to do is that the lobbying effort by organizations like the ARA and NAPA is paying off, right? That since this president has come in a year and a half ago-ish, and didn't have a very well-articulated retirement policy like maybe some other candidates out there, the lobbying efforts by the industry to take us in a better direction than we've been maybe in the last 8 years or even longer, depending. Or maybe others would see it as simply a 2.0 or a 3.0 or a 4.0, however you want to talk about it. But just that the constant involvement of the retirement industry, our lobbying efforts are paying off, right? If we're going to talk about electronic disclosure in a little while, that's been a project of the ARA and NAPA. So that's my first impression.
Well, and Tom, when you say ARA and NAPA, American Retirement Association, one of the member organizations is National Association of Plan Advisors. And when you talk about lobbying, that means a couple different things. And actually, my experience with both organizations, and all three of us have long been members, so we're all very active in these organizations. Not necessarily pro-MEP. So I think it's fair to say ARA has actually been concerned about MEP regulation and legislation, and maybe a little fearful of it, but has gotten comfortable with what's going on here and has in fact been involved behind the scenes with the administration. And another point worth making is that RISA is not just about multiple employer plans, is it, Tom?
No. It isn't the last proposed bill also address retirement income safe harbors, and there's some other smatterings of issues in there as well.
It does, and so there are probably, I think in the original RISA there were something like 28 separate retirement provisions. I think there's something like a dozen in the new version. Yeah. So this is actually a fairly comprehensive pension bill. The MEPs is just one part of it. So that's a big part of the lobbying side. Randy, what's your first impression of this thing?
Yeah, I think it's a step in the right direction. I think it's true to form, to the present administration and trying to cut regulatory red tape and make things simpler and scale back some of the intervention from various agencies and regulatory bodies. So I think it's a step in the right direction for small employers to be able to gain access to affordable retirement plan savings.
Well, and I'll offer this thought that one of the things that stood out to me in the public announcement of this thing was the statement that that the method here, that where we're going with the method for rolling out this association retirement plan, multiple employer plan, making that easier, is to roll back regulations and not add any more. So it was a specific comment by the Small Business Administrator that there would not be new regulations. So that is a significant comment. So in other words, if you think about 2012-04A as being the obstacle to open MEPs, if the result of this is nothing more than a rollback of that, take that away, well, then what would that mean? I would argue that things are not actually super clear, but I think the industry's perception would probably be, and the DOL under this approach would likely support it, that if 2012-04A is gone, well, then open MEPs are now okay. That's the whole point of rolling back that particular piece of guidance, and that the DOL would say so, and therefore the door is open. And that specific statement by the Small Business Administrator, to me, was very significant because if that's in fact what is done, then instead of seeing new regulation or new rules, we might just see a rollback. I think personally, it's more likely we will get a little bit more than that. For example, the bad apple rule. So the bad apple rule is when, if one member of a MEP, one employer, adopting employer within a multiple employer plan, has a defect, then the whole MEP could be disqualified. And that sounds terribly scary to anybody who doesn't know MEPs. And in reality, it's not that scary for a variety of reasons. But there's this perception that needs to be fixed. Well, that's a Treasury thing, and it's statutory. So they can't just overturn that. Presidential order can't just overturn the bad apple rule. There has to be some actual regulatory change there. So I think we will see inevitably something more come out of this. So I'm going to one other slide with a little bit of background. We're just hit a series of questions from the panel. So I think it's important to point out what is and is not a multiple employer. What does it do and what does it not do? The emphasis of the administration and the emphasis in the conversation today, the public announcements, is all about cost. So there's this focus on cost, that retirement plans cost so much money that small businesses can't afford to start them, and that the multiple employer plan will result in significantly greater adoption. I believe that that's true, but MEPs are not going to single-handedly close the coverage gap. They are not a magic wand to cut fees in half. And I'll give you an example of that. That if you think about what a major record keeper has to do in order to record keep a plan, they have to have a relationship with the employer who has to submit payroll. There are uploads. That payroll person has to interact with the system. Every time you change that payroll person, you have a new person who has to learn details. And this isn't, it's not like you can simply add employees to one plan and the base cost of interacting with that employer goes away. So in reality, the record keeping cost is very little affected by the MEP structure. Now, Randy, you mentioned that you've been able to negotiate favorable rates on investments using the power of your firm's, pretty substantial weight as an investment firm, the assets under management. That's something that is directly affected by the MEP structure. So it's a very effective negotiating tool. It is a simple plan. It is structurally able to get employers out of the middle of administrative tasks better than any other structure, because the employer is no longer the plan sponsor. They no longer have their own plan document. They no longer have to have their own fiduciaries appointed committees, meetings, minutes, RFPs, RFIs, benchmarking. The stuff you do because you're an employer gets structurally eliminated in the multiple employer plan structure. That's one of its principal advantages. So there are advantages, but it's not going to close the coverage gap. And it's not, for example, going to take a $6,000 thing, which a retirement plan is today. It's not going to take that $6,000 thing and turn it into a $1,000 thing. So we're still going to have a need for things like simple IRA, SEPs, payroll deduct IRA. This is not the sole answer to the coverage gap, but that was a major focus of the administration's announcement, was cost. And then part of that cost picture is, what does it mean if you're running one of these things? So if you're running a multiple employer, what does that actually mean? So one of the things that the president mentioned was that these could be centrally administered. Well, that's the whole point. And the person overseeing that might be someone like the Charlotte Chamber of Commerce, which was one of the organizations represented there today. So if you're a fiduciary in charge of a multiple employer plan that instead of just having one small company has 20 or 50 or 500, you have a lot of small employers within this plan, what kind of scrutiny can you expect? And this has always been something that is apparent to those of us who already do these things. But if this cat in the picture is the DOL, the fish in the bowl are the MEP fiduciaries. And you're in a regulatory fishbowl as a fiduciary when you take a whole bunch of people's assets and you put it all together. So you better do it right. And historically in our industry, it has always been the case that getting it done right by professional fiduciaries, focusing on making sure things are as they should be, that is more expensive than focusing on cheap. So cheap typically comes from having a solution that is self-administered and having software that's rented out by a small employer, but not having them really get meaningful help in actually running the thing. So, there is a dichotomy here that the industry will figure out, and there will be ways, and there will be cheap solutions, and there will be 20 different variations of this. But fundamentally, what I see happening here is the proliferation of MEPs is clearly beginning. It's been going on for a while. This is going to spark it. But people will need to remember that we are going to be, those of us who run multiple employer plans, under scrutiny from the regulators in a nice, contained fishbowl kind of environment, and that has implications. So let's go on to some more talking points. So Randy, let me start with you on this first question of the policy goal. What do you think are the policy goals here, and what do you think they should be, and kind of just how do you feel about this approach to retirement security?
Well, as you've articulated, I think it's a way to get more more employers involved, as well as simplify things and being able to administer a plan effectively. So I think part of it is coverage. It's not going to solve the entire American workforce, but for a lot of those smaller plans, I feel that the policy is really to try and engage more participants in saving for retirement.
And Randy, so you've been, again, part of this conversation for a long time. What do you see your peers doing? What's the conversation like among RIA firms and aggregator RIA firms, have they come to be called, firms like yours who acquire or attract other investment advisors?
Yeah, I definitely think that there's a number of our peers that have also created these plans. I think there's been a lot of wait and see type of attitude in terms of some of the bills that are in Congress now, and certainly this executive order gives us some encouragement to have these plans even take off. I think everyone kind of gets the concept of scale, and that we need to get more people saving, particularly in the small end, that this could be a really good solution for many plan sponsors. So I think that's the attitude or the tone in the industry. And I think employers want something that's simple, and they want something that's cost effective. I think what prevents a lot of folks from smaller employees from setting the plans up is cost.
Yeah, and I'm just curious about your take on what I just said about the $6,000 thing and the $1,000 thing. Probably the low end of getting a 401k in the United States is somewhere around $4,000. You might, for about $4,000 as a startup, you might be able to get a plan. What's your perception of realistically how much the multiple employer solution can make a dent in the coverage gap? Because I personally believe it will in fact make a dent, but how big of a dent? What do you feel about that with respect to the small employers?
Even if it moved it by, increased, coverage by 10 or 15%, I think there will be a lot of associations, the Chamber of Commerce, industry associations that will come together, and it'll be an opportunity to sponsor these type of plans. We've all seen with what the success that the American Bar Association has had in their particular plan and the impact that that's had. So I think there is some broad appeal, but part of it's cost, but also part of it is just best practices and making it simple for employers to be able to adopt these and know that they're being professionally managed.
Well, and sort of a side note about the fact that the president chose to emphasize, and not just the president, but just the entire tone of the conversation, emphasize the association side, and that there were 3 associations present there. So a little bit of law there. The definition of employer includes a group or association of employers, and that's kind of where the 2012 04A came from. And so, but is even an association or a chamber of commerce a group or association? And actually, the answer is no. So the current view is that a chamber of commerce is a good example of someone who does not have enough nexus or commonality among its members to qualify as having a single plan for ERISA purposes. But so this is seen as a good thing. But the political side, let's just talk, and I don't mean political in a negative sense so much as like what's going on here. I'll offer a comment, and Tom will see what you think about just the nature of what.
Hold on a second, Pete, because I think I have a slightly different angle on the policy goal, right? That I'd like to offer. And I mean, number one, I think it goes without saying that the current system we've been sitting around in 1974 and had said amongst ourselves, all right, gentlemen, let's invent the most inefficient system of delivering benefits possible. This is the one that we would have, right? Where lawyers, doctors, plumbers alike are fiduciaries to plans. So I just think that's worth mentioning that this is a good step in the direction of kind of undoing that, moving away from that policy decision that was made. But one thing we've talked about costs. For a moment, let's abandon costs for a second. I think an unspoken benefit of what is a consequence of this is innovation. And I'm surprised that they're not picking up on this more, because I advise quite a few service providers in the industry. Our firm does, and you guys are both service providers. And if I were to tell you from your perspective, or if I were to ask you from your perspective of what's one of the hardest parts of serving these smaller plans, it's an issue of scale, it's an issue and so on. But what I see happening here is it's not just scale, but once we get the scale and we get all these disparate employers going in the same direction and all looking alike and talking alike and sounding alike from a plan structure perspective, that is going to be the opportunity for innovation that then can be scaled widespread across these plans. So for an example, simultaneous to all of these moves on PEPs, we see a lot of moves towards managed accounts, right? Reducing the onus on plan participants to manage their own money. Some people might call that the DBification of defined contribution plans. I see that as easier if we have MEPs or PEPs or association retirement plans, ARPs, whatever we want to call them, right? We'll call them MEPs because that's what we've been calling it. Those kinds of innovations. This past week, we saw I believe it was a private letter ruling that went out. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, Pete, because I'm sure you picked up on it, on the idea that you can build student loan benefits into 401k plans. That's another innovation. Financial wellness, we see that out there. We could just keep going. The more we structure these things on a larger scale, the more we're going to have innovations come, and we could be having this webinar a year or 2 or 3 years from now. And my hope is that looking back, we couldn't even imagine what's going to come in the future as the providers get that scale so then they can issue those widespread innovations.
So that's an interesting point that you started off with there, Tom, that ERISA created. If we wanted to create the most inefficient structure, this would be it. We do have something like 2 million amateur fiduciaries in the U.S. because of our system. The other side of that is the employer-based retirement system in the United States is the most successful on the planet. And because of it, we have more assets in our funded retirement system than in all of the rest of the countries on earth combined. And that's really because an army of golfing salespeople, so to speak, went out and sold 401ks going back, 30 years or and longer. So but it only got so far because the smallest of companies really couldn't go there. But the efficiency factor is significant. So Randy, you're a 338 investment manager. So you're an investment manager to plans. You've been an investment consultant or advisor. So there's a difference between advising and managing. Which is easier in your experience, and how do you see that playing out in the MEP context? How does that affect you, and how does it affect your clients?
Well, I think Tom's point in terms of innovation, I think is really where a lot of gain will come with scale and innovation, and being able to offer a MEP that is innovative, and scale does bring some of those economies of scale to do some of those things with technology platforms and groups being able to band together. And I think it's important, just raises the conversation about retirement. So it gives retirement some focus, and the need for savings for retirement. But I think some very innovative things everywhere from solving for the student loan issues could come through this, or a managed account solution, or an income withdrawal strategy could be developed through this plan.
Thanks for mentioning that one. I should have mentioned that one. That equally, totally agree with you.
So Randy, if you're, one of the things that we see in terms of how these things actually get structured. So if you have a single employer, you're the investment advisor, you're going to advise the plan on what the investments are. Compare that to being an investment manager, and then compare being the investment manager to a MEP. And what I'm looking for is, what's the workload? How does that affect your ability to deliver the investment services, the efficiency of it, and how is that getting translated for your clients?
I think there's tremendous efficiencies when you have one single, fund line of broadcasting across multiple clients, in terms of being able to scale that, and being able to have when you have discretion as a 338, being able to make those fund changes, but be able to share those, in one common report across multiple clients via a webcast. So from that standpoint, I think it's efficient for the advisor to step in and being able to help them scale their practice by basically doing one investment review as opposed to having to do 25 or 30. So I think there's some tremendous benefits, even from technology and interfacing. And one of the things that we've kind of learned, kind of came out of our retirement plan council, or our advisory board that we have, is clients love to hear from other clients, what they're doing for their plans. And so we've gotten a lot of interaction from our MEP employers that often are maybe in the same community, but even maybe in different industries, and just them sharing best practices with one another. So oftentimes there's kind of safety in numbers, and maybe some plan design, some not just hearing it from the advisor, but hearing it from another employer and how it's worked for them, I think is valuable feedback of that exchange amongst employers on best practices.
Well, and so Randy, what that makes me think of is you and I go back a ways in the MEP conversation. One of my early introductions to this was a program for municipalities, for which you were selected as the 338 investment advisor. And we saw that this program for municipalities, on the surface, why wouldn't they adopt it? But municipalities don't move very fast. And I don't know if you've seen anything different over the years from that program, but I'm curious if you think that the sort of the public relations side of this, that the fact that the government in essence is behind multiple employer plans, won't push programs like that to actually be more successful and have more people adopting them.
Yes, no, absolutely. And we've seen that, Pete, in other work that we've done, whether it be in higher education, or certainly in the government marketplaces. Those groups like to flock together. So we've seen that a lot in the higher education, and universities, or education systems all banding together, and adopting a common plan. So I think this kind of opens it up for more for greater opportunities for for employers to save, and for advisors to be able to serve and help out plan sponsors in a more scalable, efficient manner.
So let me ask this: some of this for I think we're in a rapidly moving time. We all see the pace of technology, artificial intelligence, all this other stuff, and we're wondering, when are the robots coming for me? And a lot of folks think, oh my gosh, we're doomed. There aren't going to be any jobs. You know what? 70%. There's an industry that had 70% of all the jobs in the United States 100 years ago. Farming. Farming was 70% of the jobs in the United States. It's now like 2 or 4% of the jobs in the United States, and we have other jobs. I am a glass half full kind of guy. I do not believe technology is going to doom us all. I think it's actually, I'm a rational optimist along the lines of Matt Ridley's book. And so I think there's good stuff coming. But this is a big change. And with these changes, even though there's good that comes of it, there's a lot of dislocation. So, take the example of, Randy, that you mentioned of higher ed. If there are 30 schools in a state that band together in a multiple employer plan with $1 billion, and they hire you as a 338 investment manager, that's 30 schools who may have had separate investment advisors over that plan. That's not good news for those individual investment advisors who had those relationships. But I think that the fear may be overwrought. The need for services is still there. Absolutely, there'd be dislocation. But, how do you guys feel about how everyone in the industry should feel about what's going on here?
I mean,
Well,
I see it as an opportunity. You take it. Because I see it as a positive opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it raises the awareness of the importance for retirement overall. And I don't see it as a threat to an advisor. I see it as an opportunity to bring groups together and to serve plan sponsors. So the devil's in the details. We don't have a lot here in terms of what we're going off of. A lot of what we're doing here is just speculating in terms of what the actual effects will be. We certainly know what's in RISA, and there's a lot of positive things there for the retirement industry overall. But I think there is with setting the limit at below 100 employers, 100 employees is a way to address the smaller ones. So I don't think it's a threat to the advisors. I know some people feel differently about that. They think that if there's some type of relief, there's the cotton bill that a lot of people are opposed to. So, I think we have to just wait and see how all this plays out. But anytime you're getting the president talking about, savings, I think is important.
So, Tom, let me turn to you for a second. Just talk about what the executive order does, and what we have from the White House right now is that the president is instructing the Department of Labor and the Department of Treasury to consider regulations or other guidance that would make association retirement plans or multiple employer plans, as they are called, and that's almost exactly the wording from the White House, that would make these things more broadly available. So I think my own high-level interpretation, what is this really saying? Well, it's saying open MEPs are going to be a thing again from the standpoint of single audit bond 5,500, not simply, banding together under a single document, but doing a single 5,500 audit bond. So completing the circle, if you will, of how that works. So even though the effect of that might actually be nominal from a compliance standpoint, there is still there's a guidance thing here. So what guidance, what's the path here? Like when the agencies get instructed by the president to do something like this, what do you think it might look like?
Well, in recent times, I'm not sure we have some timely examples, because didn't President Trump issue an executive order that the Department of Labor needed to reconsider the fiduciary rule? And it took, a year and a half later in the Fifth Circuit for something to actually happen. I understand they delayed it for a long time, and we had the transition BIC and all of that. So what my gut tells me, the immediate answer to your question is, don't hold your breath, right? It'll be months before we see something from the Department of Labor. Why? Because they're a very purposeful, careful agency. They always have been. They know better than anyone that if you poke at the retirement scheme we have in this country, you can have unintended consequences. And so, look at what we've seen on socially responsible investing and the ping pong back and forth, over years. And don't do this, don't do that. Okay, we were just kidding over here. But, you can totally consider them. And so what I see happening is the DOL moving methodically and taking their time in following up with what the president has asked. I don't expect something next week. But when we do get something from them, talking about your earlier conversation, it is likely for them to pull the previous advisory opinion, keeping with the president's remarks that they want to not have more regulation. I expect that they would issue maybe a field assistance bulletin or something other less than an advisory opinion, so that they can claim it's not regulation, but that they will issue some sort of informal guidance for those folks that want to go in this direction. And I would say maybe three months, if I were to just guess, before we see something like that, maybe before the end of the year.
Well, and that's an interesting. So your willingness to guess, first of all, is appreciated. I think we all know that anything can happen, but one of the things that I find interesting about this approach is that pulling back an advisory opinion is well within the rapid power of any agency, and therefore within the power of the president. So a regulation takes longer, and if there were a law, there'd be a law followed up by regulation that would take longer still. So one of the things that I think made it worthwhile for us to have this conversation today immediately versus waiting, to give people a sense for what's going on, is actually they could act pretty quickly here, and it would take them a heck of a lot longer if they're going to issue regulations. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, the regulatory process is one of years, right? I mean, we saw that the fiduciary rule took 9 years, one iteration, withdrawn again. But even if everyone was on the same page, issuing a regulation requires a certain amount of time for comments, 60 to 90 days. I can't remember exactly what it is, but let's just say it's around that time. And then they have to process those comments, and then they have to issue a final regulation. And this is when it's not controversial. Let's say everyone agreed. I mean, you're talking at least a 6 to 12 month process on the regulatory, when you're issuing regulations. I agree with you, Pete. They could withdraw the advisory opinion, and maybe I'll be pleasantly surprised, and I'll be the first one to say it, that they've been working on what to do here, and the DOL will take rapid steps on Monday or Tuesday, I guess, because Monday's a federal holiday. Wouldn't that be wonderful if they already had themselves armed with whatever informal guidance they're going to do here? That would be a wonderful surprise, and would not. I think what you're fishing for would not take that 6 to 12 month time period of regulation making. What my fear though is the rapid nature of what we've seen with this administration is that things aren't necessarily well thought out and well planned, and so. What we sitting here on this call don't know is when Secretary Acosta and Assistant Secretary Rutledge got the call from the White House that this is where they were going. I mean, they could have gotten that call yesterday, right, or Tuesday. I guess we kind of knew earlier in the week, but I mean, they could have gotten that call Tuesday and told they needed to do this versus getting that call 2 months ago and saying, "Hello, DOL, get ready for this moment." So we'll find out.
Yeah, and I guess a couple final points here, and we'll start to wrap up. There is in fact the power to act rapidly. I am not predicting that they will. I'm not predicting anything. And the other thing I'm not saying is that this is either good or bad. I am excited that there is movement toward promoting these things because I believe in them. So of course I think that's positive. But anything could happen. But I think it is absolutely the case that this choice of path is interesting because the longest path clearly would be pass a law and then write regulations, comment period, Administrative Procedures Act, propose regulation, comment period, send it to the Office of Management and Budget, 90-day review, followed by comment period, and then it becomes effective, a year later or something. That's the way it rolls. So that takes a lot longer. But to your point, some sub-regulatory guidance, and an advisory opinion is sub-regulatory guidance. That doesn't have to follow those procedures. So it is quicker. So there's the potential for something to happen quickly. The final point I would make is just simply that's not necessarily either good or bad. We've said at Pentegra for a long time, We don't need new laws and new regulations on this stuff. There are structures available today under current rules with no changes that are viable and useful, and in some ways, maybe even better than what might emerge from this. Like if we were to get into talking about the audit rule, that's a conversation for another day. Audits are a burden, not necessarily a help. They can be a good thing too. Don't get me wrong, but if you're a small employer, you don't want an audit, and you don't want a call from an auditor. So that's not a benefit in the eyes of a small employer. So there are lots of things that could happen here, and we're perfectly happy at Pentegra if nothing happens. But we're also excited to see movement. So be interesting to see how it does, in fact, unfold. Gentlemen, any final thoughts before we sign off and maybe take a question or two? All right, and we do have questions, so give me a moment and let me see if I can blow this up to where I can actually read the questions. Beth, I might need you to help me out here. I'm not having trouble reading the questions on my screen. But here's a first question. What, if anything, does this order do for the possibility of 403B MEPs? I have never come across a 403B MEP. So actually, Randy and I are both involved in one such MEP that's very large, kind of the first of its kind. The rules under 403B for multiple employer plans kind of aren't there. And the same thing for 457B, and we've both been involved in 457B multiple employer plans. So these things are out there, and there is broad consensus in the legal community that they're okay. There is a legal principle called nulla poena sine lege. It's no penalty without a law from Latin, and it's a basic principle of most legal systems on the planet. So if it isn't forbidden, it's permitted. And 403B MEPs are not forbidden. So the question would be, what rules are they subject to? So there are 403B MEPs out there today. Now, an open MEP, how would you run an open MEP? Another conversation. It is certainly my opinion they are possible today and they exist today. There just aren't many of them. But it would be cool if we could get something explicit from regulators saying, not only is this explicitly okay, but here's what you need to think about as far as how to do your compliance work.
Yeah, I mean, I know that, Pete, you've been involved in some of those. I've been involved in some of those. We have a non-ERISA 403B MEP that's existed here in the St. Louis area for local public school systems that has been going for a number of years. It was an individually designed plan, and I believe got a determination letter when you could get those things previously. But our volume submitter, the Wagner Law Group 403B volume submitter had an association box on it. So arguably our volume submitter could be used as a MEP document if they're closely associated enough under those rules. And so, I mean, yeah, it's going in that direction, but I do agree with you that there's nothing explicit in the statute that says yes, right, like there are for other types of plans. But it's happening.
All right, and that is the only question that I have posted online. I think to wrap this up, this was deliberately intended to be just a first glance at what was necessarily a vague public announcement from the administration. It was an administrative and executive order to follow a certain direction, but it seems fairly clear from context and explicit statements that the intention is to make open MEPs more easily possible. The opposite of what happened in 2012. That seems to be the very clear intention of the White House. The White House does have the ability to control the departments, the agencies of the executive branch, including DOL and Treasury, and the types of changes that are needed, at least the one about open MEPs, is a relatively easy one to make from a process standpoint. It doesn't take as long as getting a law, doesn't take as long as getting a regulation. Its sub-regulatory guidance could make something happen. So if something does happen, it could be done more quickly than other means might require. So with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and in particular, Randy and Tom, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Pete.